Technology Foundation Incorporated, bringing community development with quality education for progress. Once again, I am Judith Revilla, your subject teacher for Creative Nonfiction. And you can also visit our e-learning site at gaif.com/elearning for your online class. This is Creative Nonfiction, Quarter 1, Week 2. But first, let us read our objectives. First, identify the fictional elements in the text. Next, list down the nature and characteristics of creative nonfiction. Third, identify the symbols, different types of irony, and figures of speech used in a particular text. Lastly, reflect on one's own values. What is creative nonfiction? Nonfiction is writing that is based on events, people, places, and facts. It is a vast category that has subgenres. It could be factual, like a scientific paper. It could also be creative, like a personal essay. The label creative nonfiction can apply to various categories of writing, including food, travel, memoir, personal essay, and other hybridized forms. Its defining characteristics is the use of literary techniques to create a sense of artfulness in the language, character development, and story, all of which tends to drive the narrative inward. Creative nonfiction works also tends to focus on transformational events in the narrator's or central character's life. It generally seems closer to the truth of the narrator's experience than other forms of nonfiction, as revealing the character's experience, emotional consequence of the experience often seems the implicit goal of the work. Because of these characteristics, creative nonfiction as a literary genre appeals both to reader and the writer as well. A creative nonfiction work can sound very personal and deeply revealing, and the resulting authenticity can have profound effects. The writer who has experienced that particular event being narrated is in the best position to talk about the experience from his or her viewpoint. The reader, on the other hand, can feel an affinity towards the writer's work as it was narrated from an authentic, no-filter landscape, hence making it something to be trusted. Ligetkind 2019 has this to say in describing the art of creative nonfiction, a concept that offers great flexibility and freedom, while adhering to the basic tenets of nonfiction, writing, or reporting. In creative nonfiction, writers can be poetic and journalistic simultaneously. Creative nonfiction writers are encouraged to utilize fictional techniques in their prose, from scene to dialogue, to description to point of view, and be cinematic at the same time. Creative nonfiction writers write about themselves and or capture real people and real life in ways that can and have changed the world. What is most important and enjoyable about creative nonfiction is that it only not allows but encourages the writer to become a part of the story or essay being written. The personal involvement creates a special magic that alleviates the suffering and anxiety of the writer's experience. It provides any outlets for satisfaction and self-discovery, flexibility, and freedom. Elements of creative nonfiction. Creative nonfiction blurs the distinction between fiction and nonfiction, but only the periphery of knowledge, where fact and truth are unavailable to obscured. In the periphery of knowledge is the one thing that delineates one from the other. Logically, it follows the creative nonfiction shares similar elements with fiction. Let's find it out. First is plot. Plot is one of the basic elements of every story. Put simply, plot refers to the actual events that takes place within the bounds of your narrative. Using our rhetorical situation vocabulary, we can identify plot as the primary subject of a descriptive personal narrative. Three related elements to consider are scope, sequence, and pacing. Scope. The term scope refers to the boundaries of plot. Where and when does the story begin and end? What is its focus? What background information and details does the story require? Narrative scope can be thought of as the ages of the photograph. A photo, whereof the vast landscape or a microscopic organism, has boundaries. Those boundaries inform the viewer's perception. The view we determine scope varies based on rhetorical situation. But generally, many developing writers struggle with a scope that is too broad. Writers find it challenging to zero in on the events that drive a story and delete unnecessary information. Sequence. The sequence of the plot, the order of the events, will determine the reader's experience. There are an infinite number of ways one might structure the story, and the shape of the story is worth deep consideration. Although the traditional forms of a narrative sequence are not the only options. Let's take a look at a few tried and true shapes a plot might take. Phrase tags pyramid. Chronological. Following this sequence, the narration starts from exposition to rising action, climax, falling action, and eventually resolution. In medias res. In Latin, this means the middle of things. Hence, the narration does not follow the linear or chronological structure. Instead, the story starts right in the middle of the action. This is an exciting way to grab the reader's attention, especially when they ask, "Just what the heck is going here?" right from the beginning. Non-linear narrative. In this technique, the narrative may be told in a series of flashback or vignettes, or it might jump back and forth in time. In using non-linear narrative, writers should make clear the reason for doing so. Pacing. This refers to the speed and fluidity with which a reader moves through your story. This being said, the flow. Narration of an event can be fast or slow. Characters. Characters bring life to the story. Keep in mind that while human characters are most frequently featured in the story, sometimes there are non-human characters in a story such as animals or even an environment itself. Characterization. Characterization refers to the development of characters through actions, descriptions, and dialogue. Your audience may be more engaged with a sympathetic toward your narrative if they vividly imagine the characters as real people. Like setting description, characterization relies on specificity. To break it down to process, characterization can be accomplished in two ways. Directly, through specific description of the character. What kind of clothes do they wear? What do they look, smell, sound, or like? While indirectly, through the behavior, speech, and thoughts of the character. What kind of language, dialect, or register do they use? What is the tone, inflection, and timbre of their voice? How does their manner of speaking reflect their attitude toward the listener? How do their actions reflect their traits? What undermine that they won't share with the world? Point of view. The writer's narrative position is informed by point of view and the emotional variables referred as tone and mood. Simply put, point of view is the perspective from which the story is told. It is also a grammatical phenomenon as it is dependent on pronoun use and impacts tone, mood, scope, voice, and plot. Although point of view will influence tone and mood, we can also consider what feelings we want to convey and inspire independently as part of our narrative position. Tone. This is an emotional register to the story's language. What emotional states that the narrator or the story, not the author but the speaker, seem to be in? What emotions are you trying to imbue in your writing? Mood. This refers to the emotional register a reader experience. What emotions do you want your reader to experience? Are they the same feelings you experience at the same time? Angle. This element refers to the specific or particular standpoint from which the narrative is told. Visualize yourself writing about a chair. You were standing right in front, so you can describe how it looks from the front. But of course, you might stand to one side and see another aspect which you might not see from the front. You can even more back and take a look from the back, or even from the top. From these different standpoints, you might be able to write different things about the chair. Setting in atmosphere. Each story has a setting. The setting is the place where the story takes place. Usually, an effective story establishes its setting early in the story. Otherwise, readers will have a difficult time visualizing the action of the story. Symbols and symbolisms. Writers will use symbols to give meaning to the objects or events that are outside of the literal. Many people are similar with common symbols in everyday life, like red rose are symbols of love, and dove are symbols of peace. Many classic works of literature employ symbolism. Symbolism in literature provides a way for a writer to explore depth, frequently through double meaning. For example, if a character crosses a river, the writer is usually implying symbolism to signify rebirth, like baptism. Many writers use color for symbolism, with white representing good, black representing evil, and green symbolizing new life. Symbolism in literature is often used to evoke various archetypes, such as good versus evil. When a character takes a trip, it is usually symbolic for a journey to discover the self. Authors use symbolism to tie certain things that may initially seem unimportant to more universal themes. The symbols then represent these grander ideas for qualities. Irony. Irony is a literary device or event in which how things seem to be in fact very different from how they actually are. If this seems like a loose definition, don't worry, it is. Irony is a broad term that encompasses three different types of irony, each with their own specific definition: verbal irony, dramatic irony, and situational irony. Most of the time when people use the word irony, they're actually referring to one of these specific types of irony. There are three types of irony. Verbal irony is a figure of speech in which the literal meaning of what someone says is different from and often opposite to what they actually mean. For example, if someone has a painful visit to the dentist and when it's over says, "Well, that was pleasant," they're using verbal irony because the intended meaning of their words, that is, wasn't all pleasant, is the opposite of the literal meaning of the words. Verbal irony is the most common form of irony. In fact, it is the common that when people mention irony, they often are actually referring to verbal irony. Dramatic irony is a plot device that highlights the difference between characters' understanding of a given situation and that of the audience. When the audience watching a movie know what's behind that door, but the character in the movie has no idea, that's dramatic irony. Situational irony refers to an unexpected, paradoxical, or perverse turn of events. It is an example of situational irony when, in the O. Henry story The Gift of the Magi, a young wife cuts off her hair in order to buy her husband a chain for his prized watch. But the husband sells his watch to buy his wife a comb for her beautiful hair. That's situational irony. Besides the three main types of irony described above, two other literary devices, which is sarcasm and satire, share a lot in common with irony. Sarcasm is a bitter cutting or mocking tone used to denigrate a particular person, place, or thing. It can sometimes take the form of verbal irony. For instance, if you were to say to someone who had just cut you in line, "What a polite, civilized person you are," that would be sarcasm in the form of irony, since your meaning is the opposite to the literary meaning of your words. Sarcasm very often involves irony. However, it doesn't always have to use irony. For instance, when Groucho Marx says, "I never forget a face, but in your case, I'll be glad to make an exemption," he is being sarcastic, but his words, however witty they are, mean exactly what they say. Satire is a form of social or political critique like sarcasm. It often makes use of irony, but it isn't always ironic. Figures of speech. There are various rhetorical uses of language that depart from customary construction, word order, or significance. Specifically, a figure of speech is a rhetorical device that achieves a specific effect by using words in a distinctive way. Though there are hundreds of figures of speech, here are most common you will encounter either in prose or poetry writing. Alliteration, the repetition of an initial consonant sound. Example, She sells seashells by the seashore. Number 2. Anaphora. The repetition of the same word or phrase at the beginning of successive clauses or verses. Example: Unfortunately, I was in the wrong place at the wrong time, on a wrong date. Antithesis. A juxtaposition of contrasting ideas in balanced phrases. Example: As Abraham Lincoln said, folks who have no vices have very few virtues. Apostrophe. Directly addressing to an existent person or an inanimate objects as though it were living being. Example: Oh, you stupid car, you never work when I needed you to. Bird's eye. Assonance. Identity of similarity in sound between internal vowels in neighboring words. Example: How now, brown cow. Chiasmos. A verbal pattern in which the second half of an expression is balanced against the first, but with the parts reversed. Example: The famous chef said people should live to eat, not eat to live. Euphemism: the substitution of an inoffensive term for someone considered offensively explicit. Example: We're teaching our toddler how to go potty, Bob said. Hyperbole: an extravagant statement, the use of exaggerated terms for a purpose of emphasis and heightened effect. Example: I have a ton of things to do when I get home. Next, irony: the use of words to convey the opposite literal meaning, also statement or situation where the meaning is contradicted by the appearance or presentation of the idea. Example: I love spending big bucks, said my dad, a notorious penny pincher. Litotes: a figure of speech consisting of an understatement in which an affirmative is expressed by negating its opposite. Example: $1 million is no small chunk of change. Metaphor: an implied comparison between two dissimilar things that have something in common. Example: all the world's a stage. Mythonym: a figure of speech in which a word or phrase is substituted for another in which it is closely associated. Also, the rhetorical strategy of describing something indirectly by referring to things around it. Example: that stuffed suit with a briefcase is a poor excuse for a salesman, the manager said angrily. Onomatopoeia: the use of words that imitate the sounds associated with the objects or actions they refer to. Example: the clap of thunder went bang and scared my poor dog. Oxymoron: a figure of speech in which incongruous or contradictory terms appear side by side. Example: he pooped the jumbo shrimp in his mouth. Paradox: a statement that appears to contradict itself. Example: this is the beginning of the end, said Eeyore, always the pessimist. Personification: a figure of speech in which an inanimate object or abstraction is endowed with human qualities or abilities. Example: that kitchen knife will take a bite out of your hand if you don't handle it safely. Pun: a play on words, sometimes in different senses of the same word and sometimes in the similar sense or sound of different sounds. Example: Jessie looked up at her breakfast and said, a boiled egg every morning is hard to beat. Simile: a stated comparison usually formed with like or as between two fundamental dissimilar things that have certain qualities in common. Example: Roberta was white as a sheet after she walked out of the horror movie. Synecdoche: a figure of speech in which a part is used to represent the whole. Tina is learning her ABCs in preschool. Understatement: a figure of speech in which a writer or speaker deliberately makes a situation seems less important or serious than it is. Example: you could say Babe Ruth was a decent ball player, the reporter said with a wink. Dialogue: basically, this refers to the communication between characters in narrative. A dialogue is dependent on relationship between characters, and this, in turn, can influence tone of voice, word choices such as using slang, jargon, or lingo, what details we share, and even what language we speak. Scene: a plot in any form of literature is made up of scenes. In drama, it's the subdivision of an act. Usually, it's defined by having a single setting and a certain set of characters. As in is what is shown in one time and place. And for your activity and assessment, you can visit our e-learning site at gait.com/elearning. And that would be all for today. Thank you so much for your time. Have a good day. Thank you.